Good afternoon, everyone. At least it's good afternoon for me. Hi, I'm Kevin Eikenberry. As you may know, I'm so glad that you are here for our conversation today. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Do you know what you can do to be a better leader? And would you like a list of the most important competencies for leadership effectiveness? Well, if your answer to either of those questions is yes, you are absolutely 100% in the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you are here live, please start by saying hello and telling us where you're from in the chat, wherever, or the comments, wherever you happen to be watching us. We hope that you'll do that. And while you're here, I want you to imagine that you're just joining us for a cup of coffee. So share your questions, your comments, your ideas. While you can't actually talk to me and my guests through your comments, you can do that, and you can actually guide this conversation as well. And when you do that, you'll get more from our time. It will be a more interesting time. And for everyone who's listening to the podcast version of this later, they get a better episode as well. So you're helping other people learn as well. And if you're not here live, if you are watching this as a podcast, or if you are watching it in a recorded form of any sort, you could be here live in the future. You can interact with us and do all that stuff and see these sooner, because the episode we're about to talk about won't be live on our podcast platform for several months. So you can be far ahead. And you can do that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, where you can find out what's going on, get connected to all of these live. You can just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook and remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. And today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each month we release a new skill in an advanced masterclass format designed to help you become a remarkable leader and the human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, I'm going to bring in my guest. There he is, Dr. Adam Bandelli, and I just lost my script. There we go. Here it is. Let me tell you about him very briefly. Adam is the managing director of Bandelli and Associates, a boutique consulting firm focusing on leadership advisory services and organizational effectiveness. He's the author of the book, What Every Leader Needs, the 10 Universal and Indisputable Competencies of Leadership Effectiveness. You can learn more about the book at whateveryleaderneeds.com. He's got another book coming out shortly. He's going to tell us, that might come up in our conversation. It's certainly possible. Adam, welcome. Glad that you're here, sir.
I'm glad to be here today. Thank you so much.
Glad to have you. I'm seeing a lot of comments. I'll just put some of these up there. So we've got people saying hello. We've got people in Massachusetts. Someone says it's a little late for coffee, but never too late for chocolate. We've got people in Switzerland here. Hi, Olivier, by the way. And Kevin, I love your name in Switzerland. So Adam, before we go too much further, you were telling me right before we started a little bit of the story about the shoes over your shoulder. But so just let's just start here. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How do you end up being in the leadership development, organizational effectiveness business? Tell us about your journey.
Great question. So I grew up in the 80s, like a lot of kids, idolizing Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan, Larry Bird. And throughout kind of elementary school, high school, and college, I was an athlete. And for me, it was my first foray into leadership and really seeing what makes for great teams. And so when I was in college, I was paired up with my first mentor, who was an industrial organizational psychologist. And he really kind of opened the door to me to what leadership advisors do, what executive coaches do, how to be a great consultant. And did my graduate studies, focused on my PhD and my dissertation really on two areas, leadership and influence and relationships. And so I started my career spending a decade with a global leadership consultancy, where we focused on things around executive assessments, which is really helping companies hire and onboard leaders. We did a lot of work around leadership development and executive coaching. And then we also did around training and culture work as well. So after spending about a decade there, and some of the origins around What Every Leader Needs came from that, kind of some of the background research that I conducted. I started my firm in 2016, and we've been going strong the last 5 years. I've had a lot of great clients, and it's really been enjoyable work.
All right. Well, as people that are watching saw as Adam was recounting that story to us. We got people from literally around the world here, from India to Poland to Switzerland to LA and all points in between. So you mentioned that the book talks about competencies. I sort of opened with that. That is this book, right? It's your subtitle is The 10 Universal and Indisputable Competencies of Leadership Effectiveness. So we'll get to what they are in a bit. But before we get there, talk to me about why, there are lots of competency models.
Sure. Yeah.
Lots of leadership competency models. How did you come to these 10, the indisputable and universal? Like, how did you get to that point? And then I've got another question before we'll get to that. But how did you come up with this model, your list?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's an important one. So there are really 3 different research streams or data streams that I think make for what this book includes. The first came from my work in my doctoral program at the University of South Florida, where I was exposed to leadership theories over the last 70 years, really from the 1950s on, and what makes effective leadership and what are the skills and behaviors that lead to that. The company that I spent a decade for doing global consultancy work, we had a model and a framework about how we did the work around assessments and coaching. So every company that we came into, we would build what we would call a scorecard, which were the 7 or 8 key leadership skills or behaviors that were needed for a CEO role or a CHRO role or a senior role in an organization. And while I was there, I started putting together a global database from our companies that were clients internationally, domestically, and really started to classify and categorize what were the common themes that started to emerge across industries, across sectors, and globally as well. After that time, I've done a lot of work with Korn Ferry. They have the Lominger Korn Ferry model framework, which are 38 different leadership competencies. So when I was putting the book together, I mapped the work that I had done at the other global consultancy firm with the Korn Ferry KPI dimensions and was able to see an overlap. All 38 of Korn Ferry's model, which has been validated over the globe for the last 30 or 40 years, fit nicely into the 10 buckets that were in my framework as well.
All right. So how can we, as organizations or as individuals, maybe, and it's really 2 questions, but how can we use a competency model? Like, there are lots of them, and lots of people like you and I have created them or ideated them around, for our work. But lots of, as you said, a lot of times that comes from the work we're doing with organizations. So whether you have one or are adopting one or are creating one, how can you use it? What's your advice around how to use a competency model?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I think one, the primary focus should be on how you select and place people into key roles. I mean, you look at kind of the changes we've seen now in the last couple of years with the Great Resignation in the last 6 months or so. The ability to identify the right skills, the right behaviors that are needed for key roles is critical. So selection is an important part of it. I think the second piece is really around developing high potential talent and retaining your employee network and your employee base. And so are you building programs where you're teaching people how to develop a vision for themselves personally and professionally? Are you helping them to understand diversity, equity, inclusion? So the competency models can be used around development as well. And then I think they can also be used at an organizational systemic level around culture change. So your ability to really get people aligned on the same values, beliefs, and norms, if that's based around leadership, Kevin, I think it's a really important way to get people aligned and on the same page.
I love that. So selection, attraction and selection, right? Development. And then I think that last part is really important. Thinking of, we talk a lot about helping people, and I know you do too, to identify and develop your aspirational organizational culture. And to have the tie of that to leadership, I think is critical. And I love that answer. Now, everyone's wondering, 10, right? Universal and indisputable. I'm sorry, I keep saying that because I love the way it sounds. And I love the definitive nature of it, Adam. I'm going to ask you about 3 or 4 of them, but if you just want to go quickly, it's not a test, but if you just want to, I mean, we don't need to, dive into each one, right? But just give the list to people as a starting point. So they've got a context. And so for all of you who are watching now, if you, as at any point as we go, if you have a question or a comment, please ask. A lot of you are saying where you're from, and I love that you're doing that. Feel free, though, as well, to, if you have a specific question for Adam and I to discuss, please ask it. But go ahead and give us the pieces now of the model.
Yeah. So the pieces of the framework, the model, everything starts with vision. You need a vision for yourself. You need a vision for your business. Passion is the second bucket, which really focuses on the energy and excitement that you bring to the organization. With vision and passion comes commitment. So there's this desire to really contribute to the organization, to your team. Part of that process is vigilance. And so the ability to hold yourself and other people accountable. Consistency is the fifth bucket. This is really leading with ethics and values and strong beliefs. The sixth is endurance. And so this is really having the stamina and tenacity to push through difficult and adverse times. And we've seen that a lot with COVID the last 2 years. The seventh, and probably the most important to me, is compassion. It's the ability to successfully connect with people and build strong long-term relationships. The eighth is inspiration. You need to inspire the people around you if they're going to be able to perform at their best levels. Innovation is the ninth, and this is the ability to really continuously adapt and adjust to what's going externally to your company as well as internally. And then I think the overarching bucket, number 10, is wisdom. So are you able to learn lessons about today and apply them forward into tomorrow?
I love that definition of wisdom, by the way. But I'm going to stop you right here, and I'm going to play the cynic card, which people who know me know that I'm not very good at, because that's not really me. But here's the thing: I've heard it, and you've heard it, and people out there are thinking it, right? Okay, Adam, that's a great looking list. That sounds really good. I'm not inspirational. You don't ask me to be inspirational. That's not who I am. Do I have to be inspirational to be a highly effective leader?
Yeah. So I think there's two answers to that. I think every leader can be inspirational on an individual or team level. So you may not necessarily have to be up on a stage kind of motivating people and galvanizing an audience, but are you sowing into the lives of the people around you? And are you having those connections with them so that you can promote them and push them to do better? And then I think a lot of times leaders make the mistake of thinking they have to do everything themselves, Kevin. You can surround yourself with people who are more engaging and more energetic and more passionate, who may be able to inspire their colleagues and peers. So it's never one or the other. It's both those things that can be accomplished.
All right. Awesome. So when you think about the list, and I'd be curious if anyone who's watching, if I'm going to let you answer this question too, the way that because I know how you built the model, the way I'm going to ask this question won't completely make sense, but I think you'll know where I'm headed. Like, is there one of them that surprises you?
Yeah.
Or is there one, and maybe a better way to ask it, Adam, is there one that you often find when you're working with clients that surprises them at all?
I mean, again, you got to look at the times we're in and coming out of the pandemic. Endurance is the one that has continually surprised me the last 2 years, how resilient people have had to been, how they've had to balance their personal and their professional lives, where those lines have been crossed dramatically for some people. And so leaders have really had to push themselves to not just be future focused, but to be pragmatic, to play at the right level and delegate to others, to persist through challenges, unexpected challenges in many of the times, and then to balance what they're doing tactically and strategically. So that's been the one that I've seen, that when I built the model, I was like, okay, this is important to have, but I didn't realize we'd be going through what we started to go through in 2020, and it would be that important.
Yeah. So that's actually one that I had highlighted that I thought we'd talk about today. And that is, so what are your thoughts? So I don't think anyone is going to be surprised that's important today, right? Maybe we would have been kind of like you said, like, okay, that's good, but like now you don't have to sell it today. The question that people are asking is it important? The question they're asking is, how do I build it?
Yeah.
So let's get practical about how we can help people build this competency of endurance, to build the skill of endurance. And you use the word resiliency. So let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of different things you have to think about. I think one is, what are the goals that you're setting for your people? A lot of times when we're in the unknown and we're in the uncertain, it's really, how do I navigate through these challenging times? And so a leader who is not setting these overarching grandiose goals and is very practical and pragmatic, can you set simple mile markers for your people each week, each month, so that people can track progress? Related to that, which a lot of people miss, is, are you celebrating the victories along the way? A lot of times leaders just kind of focus on what's next. What do we have to go accomplish? And at times where there's change and there's uncertainty, people want to feel a sense of community. They want to feel a sense of collaboration and camaraderie. And so celebrating successes is really, really important. The third piece, I think, is really around, are you effectively able to delegate to other people? When you don't do that, you take on too much. It can overwhelm the people around you. And so delegation plays a really important role as well.
You know, we could certainly dive into any of those. We've got some great questions that have come in. We're going to get to in a second, but I want to make a comment about your point about celebrating the small steps. And here's where I think leaders sometimes mess this up.
Yeah.
We are, if we're effective leaders, we realize we need to break things down into manageable steps, into a roadmap, and into deliverables and all that stuff. And we sort of know that we should be celebrating those wins along that roadmap. But as leaders, we're like, yeah. But I'm looking at the end. Yeah. And so we have to help our folks look at the end. Sometimes the challenge is getting them to see the end, but the challenge for us is to see the now, so that we do that celebration piece. Because a lot of times, and I've done this and had this conversation in coaching. Yeah, Kevin, but it's that we want. And it's a yes, and it's not one or the other. It's both, right? Anything you want to say about that? About connecting people back to that celebration piece?
I think for people, it's about being present in the moment. Are you able to be grounded in what's happening here and now, and not just be looking out into the future? Leaders who can be more present with their people are usually able to get the most out of them.
All right, awesome. So we've got a bunch of questions now about the passion piece. And I want to get to that's another one of the things I wanted us to talk about. I want to get to these questions, but someone asks this: passion and commitment is fine, but so we'll get to that. But I want to talk about the vision part, right? So the person asks, but how to create a vision when we ourselves don't know what vision can be like? If I put a vision for CEO, then how to put that into action? So I guess what I'm really saying is, Adam, talk a little bit more about this vision piece, and maybe talk about it if I'm not the CEO.
Yeah. If you're not the CEO and you're a member of a team, then it's really about, are you getting alignment and agreement with the people around you on what the direction or the path is that you want to go? I can think back to early in my career. I was working with a team of leaders in the retail space, and it wasn't the CEO. It was an executive vice president of part of the Northeast of the country, and new leader just stepping into the role. There was a predecessor who had been there for over a decade. So now there was this sense where you had to really establish your own bandwidth and their own way you were going to work with your folks. And so this leader was able to kind of get an idea of where they wanted to move the business. But then they got their team members together. They drove alignment and agreement so that everyone was on the same page and understood what role they would play in making the vision happen. And then really making sure that each person would have some steps that they could move forward with, and that there were accountabilities and expectations associated with them.
Beautiful. So now my question, and again, there are some that have come in that we'll get to in a second, but I want to lead with this. So when I look at the list and was reading the book, I was thinking about the 10 competencies, and I wondered how often you hear this or what your reaction to this would be. So is passion actually a competency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it absolutely is. I mean, I think you have to, as a leader, demonstrate an optimistic sense of energy and enthusiasm for people to follow. You have to be someone who is the first in there, the last to leave. You have people who look up to you. They want to model the behaviors. If they're good behaviors, if they're bad behaviors, they're going to want to run away. But there has to be a sense of an energy that you bring in terms of what you do. People need to see that. They need to see the fire in your belly. And if you don't have that, you're going to get people who are complacent. You're going to get people who may not deliver the best that they can because you don't kind of have that wiring.
Gotcha. So there are a number of questions that have come in about this, and this one comes from Miss Jody. Hi, Jody. Jody says, "Can you help me get my mind around the difference between passion and emotions?" And I think maybe your answer just helped with that a little bit. But she says, "I've received feedback that my passion is great, but it also exposes my emotions too much. As a woman, I'm struggling to understand if I should adjust or ignore the feedback, right? Yeah. Because I can't tell if I should hide my emotions more, etc." So Jody, you have two men who are going to talk to you about this. But I think there's a couple of really good things in there for Adam, for you to expand on, if you would.
Yeah. So I think we have to start with an understanding of emotional intelligence, which I define as an ability to have the self-awareness to understand your emotions, the emotions of others, and to adjust your emotions in the moment. So you can have passion, but if you don't have good EQ, you're going to run into issues with maybe showing too much frustration or too much excitement. So are you able to step into a room, understand the nuances of the people in that room, and then being able to tailor your level of energy to what's going on in the room? So I think passion is good. The filter through which it comes through really needs to be honed around EQ. If you have good EQ, you'll be able to leverage your passion in the right way, depending on the audience that you're interacting with.
And so what I would add to that, since I happen to know Joe, is that since you have good EQ, and perhaps that feedback that you're getting is coming from someone who maybe doesn't, right? So, I mean, the way I'm interpreting that question. So I think you have to bring your good sense and intuition to the table. And that would be what I would add to what Adam said. That's really, really good. So someone else, Olivier from Belgium, says, okay, but there's so many things. Do we feed all these buckets at once, or do we choose main ones? So I guess he's leading to the question of which you could ask about any competency model, Adam, like, okay, there's 10. Where do I start? Where do I focus? Yep. What's your advice? Whether they're using yours when they buy a copy of What Every Leader Needs, or the competency model in their organization. Like, how do we use that moving forward?
So I think there are three kind of super competencies, if you would, or three places where you have to set. I think, and you look at this personally or at a team level, vision has to be included in any framework. You look at most competency models, you talk about strategic thinking or intellectual horsepower. There has to be an idea of where you want to go. So that's first and foremost. In your own career, you think about people individually. Where do you see yourself, Kevin, in 10 years? Or where do you see yourself, Jody, in 10 years? And how do you want to get to that? You have to have a vision. You have to have a plan. I think the second important piece is compassion. And when I think about compassion, I think about the ability to have good communication skills, social awareness, and what I call relational intelligence. That's the focus of my next book. And it really focuses on how do you successfully connect with people and build strong, long-lasting relationships. I'm a firm believer, and I've seen this over the last 20 years of my work, relationships are everything in business, in organizations, and in working with others. So if you can't effectively connect with the people around you, and if you can't understand others and embrace individual differences and develop trust, you'll never accomplish any goals that you want to. And then third would be wisdom. We always are going to learn from successes and failures. A lot of times, and I know this in my own personal and professional life, I've learned more from adversity and failures than I've had from the successes that I've had. So if you look at it at a very high level, vision, compassion, and relationships, and wisdom would be the three that I think everyone needs in their toolkit.
I've been thinking a lot about Dr. Bjork's comments about in the learning space about desirable difficulties. So when you bring that idea of difficulties up, like how do we then address and use those challenges to our benefit? I think that's exactly right. So you mentioned it twice now about the importance of the compassion piece. You mentioned it as one of your top three. You mentioned it earlier as your favorite one. All of us have experienced a lot during the pandemic.
That's right.
Yeah. And I would guess that most people would say, okay, that one's more maybe like endurance, right? Maybe that moved up my list.
Yeah.
Based on what I now know.
It's not one that most
is that true for you? I guess what I'm saying is, what's your reflection about that? And would you have said all the same things 2 years ago that you're saying now? Or say it another way, what have you learned about that compassion competency during the pandemic? So
let me start 2 years ago, before the pandemic started. I think, and I've seen this as a leadership advisor, it's critical. Can you connect with your people? And compassion is a method to do that. It's about EQ. It's about relational intelligence. So it's always been important. It's been less important to many leaders until the pandemic. And what I have seen in the last 2 years, you tie social justice into what's gone on with the pandemic, the need to really empathize with people who are different from you, whether it's gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, your ability to get to the table and value and appreciate diversity of thought. And so that's what's really I've seen over the last 2 years that has really made compassion much more important than it may have been in the past.
Cool. I have said for a long time, wrote in a book a couple of years ago, that leadership is leadership, that think about leadership first and location second. And yet many of us are leading teams at a distance, some or all of the time. So what would your advice or wise counsel be to people as you think about what I often call the long distance difference?
Yeah.
What is your counsel to leaders today when they're doing it at a distance? I know there's a lot we could say, but like, where would you hone in there?
Yeah, I think it's really about, are you intentional about sowing into the lives of your people? So the human element moments that we're missing about sitting across the table face to face, you can still create those things through technology, even though, again, we're having a conversation now and I can't look in your eyes, you can't look in my eyes, but that you can still be intentional about spending the time with your people. Are you asking about what's going on for them personally? Do you have an understanding of what each individual on your team has going on, and not just what you're trying to drive at a collective or organizational level? So that I think is really the big piece. Are you taking time for your people? Are you making them feel valued and appreciated? It goes back to what I was talking about around celebrating the victories. Are you being an enabler? Are you in coaching and supporting folks rather than just trying to get to the outcomes, whether they be financial or relational, et cetera?
All right, so we're starting to get toward the end here, Adam. And again, if any of you have other questions, feel free to ask them. What didn't I ask that you wished I would have, or what should I have asked that I didn't?
Yeah. I think that the big thing for me, that when you look at leadership kind of at a holistic level, there is this idea also around innovation. And so I think a lot of times people miss out on the opportunities to anticipate the future, to really put their thoughts into action. A lot of the clients that we work with right now are thinking through innovations for their industries. They're trying to be on the forefront with those changes. And so how do you build a culture that promotes creativity? And again, it goes back to this idea. You're seeing a lot of this now. Companies are hiring for diversity and equity and inclusion. I'm a firm believer that the whole diversity framework is about diversity of thought. Can you bring a different group of people to the table and get them to have a honest, authentic, and genuine conversation about whatever issue they want to focus on? And can you value the people around the table that have those different backgrounds to get to the best outcomes for your organization?
Yeah, and of course our thoughts. So if you want to back that up to the more traditional thinking about diversity, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about, where do our thoughts come from? It comes from our perspective. It comes from our experience. So I think it's a really great way to think about it, because ultimately, when we get into doing the work, that's what we need, right? It's just that all of those other differences are what lead to our thoughts, right? And so I really think that that's a powerful way, Adam, to think about that.
Sure.
I really do appreciate that. Now, I realize that, well, I've got a couple more questions, and one of them I normally tell my guests ahead of time, and right. I didn't tell you because I forgot. Kevin didn't follow his process. But before we get to the one so now I'm just gonna let you, like, oh my gosh, what the heck's he gonna
keep me hanging? I don't know.
Before we get to that one, I got the one that'll be easy to answer. Like, what do you do for fun?
Yeah. So for me, I'm an avid golfer. So I started playing golf in graduate school. We had a group of our cohort who went through the program together. We picked it up when we started learning together. And then traveling, I did a lot of international work. I put it down for about 5-6 years, picked it back up in 2017. And I really enjoy doing destination trips that are kind of based around golf. And so I've done golfing in Hawaii. I've done golfing overseas. I just did a trip to Bermuda actually last week and was able to play on Port Royal, which is one of the famous PGA golf courses. So that's kind of something I like to do in my free time.
All right. So people that have been here before or are listening to the podcast know what I'm going to ask next, because I always ask the fun question followed by the one that I typically prepare you for. So I'm saying this to give you a bit of a respite and to not have people wonder, like if you have to pause. So the question is like, so what are you reading these days?
Yeah. Great question. So I think there are 2 books that I'm really focused on now. One is it's a classic book, Never Eat Alone. And so I think that's a really good one when you think about networking. And then again, you apply it to where we are now. We can't connect with people face to face. We're starting to go back to that. So how do you create those moments where you can network and build relationships and connect with others? So that's a really important one. And then I'm reading one called The Authentic Factor. And it's really about how can you get your leaders and your people around you to bring their true selves to their work. I did a lot of the research on those 2 books to come forward with kind of the main idea around my next book that's coming out next April, Relational Intelligence, the 5 essential skills you need to build life-changing relationships. And the vehicle, the book looks at the framework of 5 skills that help you to do that. Part of the book is the process. Another part of the book is its applications, but it's housed around this idea. Are you authentic across the board? And do you build authentic relationships?
All right. So before we go, I have a question for all of you. So first of all, I'm going to give you all inside baseball. So Adam, you passed that question with flying colors. But when I first started doing this podcast over 300 episodes ago, I got feedback from a guest that said, man, I wish I would have known you were going to ask me that, because I had to stop and think. And sometimes before we go live and I ask people, they're like, wait a minute, I got to go find the book. But you immediately, you knew exactly. So you pass with fly. Not that was a test, but you didn't need that extra time, which makes me feel better because I normally just like to give people that moment.
I would say if I wasn't doing research, I've been doing research with those 2 books. So had I not done that, I would have had to run out to my library outside my office.
So there you go. So Keith Ferrazzi, the author of Never Eat Alone, has been on this podcast. You can go back and search for that. And Keith's got a brand new book. I just got his next book is coming out next spring. It's across the room. I can't read you the title. I think it's called Competing in the New World of Work, but Keith's got a new book coming out as well. That means it's possible that he'll be back on the show at some point. It's a great book. He's a great guy. So question for all of you before Adam and I wrap up. It's a question I ask you all every week, because it's the question of application, right? It's the 2-word question of application. Now what? What are you going to do with this? What's the action that you will take as a result? I mean, hopefully you'll go out and buy a copy of the book wherever fine books are sold, right? We'll put that link up here where you can go get a copy, but hopefully you'll buy a copy of the book, but that's not what I mean. When I ask you now what, when I ask you that question, I'm saying, what action are you going to take as a result of this? Are you going to think differently and perhaps say, how do I get more diversity of thought around me? Whether that's on my team or in my group of advisors or whatever that is. Which of these competencies might you decide you need to take some action on? What idea did you get from Adam that you need to think about more and maybe act on? And perhaps that was as simple as I was reminded today that I need to delegate more, or I was reminded today that I need to be more intentional about my interactions with and my relationship building with my team, whatever it is. None of this matters if you don't take some action. So last question from you, Adam, where do you want to point people? Where can people learn more? Where can they get to know you better? Where can they reach out to you, et cetera?
Absolutely. So you guys can go to our website, Bandelli and Associates. It's a letter A-N-D. There we go, right there. To learn about our new service and offerings. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing a lot next year around this concept of relational intelligence. You can find out more there. You can find out about the current book, What Every Leader Needs, at whateverleaderneeds.com. And then you can also follow me on social media, on LinkedIn. You can also follow our Bandelli and Associates Facebook page, as well as our LinkedIn and Instagram pages as well.
All the ways that you can get a hold of and interact with and learn from and with Adam. He's just shared with you. Hope you'll do that. Adam, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And good to talk to you and your audience today.
All right. And so everybody, if you enjoyed this episode and you're with us live, I hope that you will share it on the social channel that you're on and tell others to come back and watch it. And if you're listening to this podcast, please let others know, share it with others. And if you're on a platform that allows you to review it or rate it, please give us your honest rating. We hope it's 5 stars. We hope you give us our honest rating. We love the feedback. And trust me, whether you liked it or not, whether you're going to be back or not, we're going to be back here next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.